I've been watching that new Watchmen show on HBO, and I gotta say, it's actually pretty good. Now, I kinda thought that it was gonna be shit, because every Watchmen sequel is kinda shit, because Alan Moore has cast a hex on anybody who tries to make Watchmen stuff, but surprise, surprise, it's actually a worthy and faithful sequel to the series, at least so far. However, a very vocal minority of the true fans don't like it. They think it's lib-cuck propaganda that ruins the legacy of the original characters. Now, this is an interesting idea to me because, if you didn't know, the original Watchmen comic is like the most liberal shit I've ever read in my life. So I really don't know what anybody expected going into this. But anyway, we'll talk about that later. For now, I'm going to talk about the other things that I think this show does really well. Now, for those of you who don't know, Watchmen is a comic about morally ambiguous superheroes. Yeah, real original, I know, but back when it came out, it was actually a fresh and new idea. Nowadays, we have lots of media that deconstructs the superhero myth, and this was just kind of the first one that did it really well. I personally prefer the approach of Watchmen over stuff like The Boys, because while The Boys takes an edgy, extreme route, Watchmen always seems more subtle and mature with its messages. Instead of asking, bro, what if Superman was evil? It asks questions like, well, what if Superman's godlike abilities left him disconnected from regular humans and he can't connect to them on an emotional level? Can he maintain healthy relationships, or is he doomed to just live alone? I always say less is more, and the more subtle approach always interests me. And that's why I like this new show so much. This show doesn't feel like a traditional sequel in that it really isn't a superhero show. Superheroes are kind of outdated and they've evolved with the times. The world has also grown a lot after the events of the comic, and the world building in this show is honestly on another fucking level. For instance, in the original comic, Nixon hired the superheroes to cover up the Watergate scandal. He remained president for a long time after that because people didn't know he was a crook. But now in the present day, Robert Redford is president, and he kind of turns America like super duper liberal. And if you are a conservative viewer, this might seem like a fucking nightmare, but the show actually does have moments where the characters lament on how frustrating the new rules can be. Cops have to have their firearms approved before they can use them, and this faulty system gets a guy killed in one of the first scenes. It's to show you that the system doesn't always work. In this world, before anybody watches a violent TV show, viewers are forced to sit through like 5 minutes of parental warnings. And to really hammer it home, you do get scenes of characters complaining about how annoying all this stuff is. So I don't really get why some viewers are so mad at this show when the show does work hard to show you that there are flaws in every aspect of the world. It'd be one thing if the show presented the world as this liberal utopia, but that's not really the case here. The show is very racially charged, however, and some people don't really like that. And if you watch the first episode, it might seem like this is the only story being told, but as the show goes on, you see that all the characters have flaws, even the ones that seem to have righteous intentions in the beginning. I mean, if you really don't like watching stuff about black people, then I can't really help you. You're kinda on your own. It's so weird. I don't understand why Watchmen is talking about current social issues so much. I thought it was about superheroes punching people.
So you like that I made your favourite superhero a heroin-addicted jazz critic who's not radioactive?
I don't read the words. I just like when he punches people.
I also love all the little Easter eggs that get sprinkled into the show, like the fact that the squids are being dropped on civilians so they still think that aliens are a threat. If you haven't read the comic, this is probably kind of confusing, and as a whole, if you haven't read the comic, this show isn't really going to make any goddamn sense at all. This show is not friendly to people who are unfamiliar with even the most obscure details of the comic. I watched the first episode with my friends who don't know nothing about Watchmen, and it was pretty confusing for them. Upon seeing Jeremy Irons, I immediately think, oh, that's Ozymandias. And I'm sure that these two are some sort of genetic experiment. Those were like my first thoughts upon seeing this scene because I just kind of thought it was obvious. And that information isn't really spelled out completely to you until later. And even then, they don't really make it clear who this man is and what he's done because they assume you know. And I mean, yeah, I know, but I can't imagine everybody with an HBO subscription had the time and foresight to sit down and read a comic book before watching this show. You can't even really rely on the movie too much because some of the stuff the movie cut or changed ends up being really important. You probably wouldn't immediately think that these two are genetic experiments because in the movie he doesn't do genetic experiments. We also have the fact that everybody in this world worships Dr. Manhattan now, and they wouldn't worship him if it was going off of the movie's rules because in the movie they think that he blew everybody up. So the movie's like good enough if that's all you have to go off of, but it's gonna make a lot of the finer details a little confusing. On one hand, it's actually pretty cool to have a show that doesn't waste its time over-explaining things to the viewers, but on the other hand, I'm curious to see how this show is perceived in the long run. These deeper comic references come into play a lot when we see characters from the original story, with my favorite being Lori, aka Silk Spectre. It's really interesting to see how she's grown and changed from the original story. She's one of the only people in the world who knows the secret about the squid attack. She knows that the New York attack was staged by Ozymandias, and she's forced to kind of just accept it and move on. This leads to her developing a similar personality to her father, the comedian. She treats everything like a joke. She doesn't care about anything because she knows nothing matters.
Who the fuck are you? Pirate Jenny.
Red Scare.
Wow. Cool.
Her arc in the original story is about her holding on to the past too much. In the end of that story, she kind of accepts that she's a slave to nostalgia. And here, she still has that outlook as well as she visits the Mars phone booth to desperately talk to Dr. Manhattan. She's dissatisfied with the present and obsessed with the past, even though she also knows the past kinda sucked too. I really like how subtle this character change is. Lori's kind of a boring character in the original story, and here they managed to make her really fucking interesting. However, I can't really sing any praises for the new characters quite yet, and I'm pretty sure it's because we aren't really that deep into the show. It's hard to judge everybody because there's still a lot we don't know. For instance, the main character is kind of solid in her beliefs, but in a way that mirrors Rorschach, and that's supposed to be seen as a bad thing. Watchmen is all about moral gray areas, and that's why Rorschach dies in the end, because he sees things in black and white and doesn't compromise. Oh, and look, she's also dressed in black and white. Maybe this means something. Also, in episode 2, she has a speech that very much mirrors him. However, it's hard to tell what route the story will take based on this, but I mean, it's fun to see the seeds planted early on. It's just hard to judge these characters early on because I don't really know where they're going to end up going. And that's kind of the vibe I get with the whole show. I really have no fucking clue where things are going, and I actually really like that. But that's enough talking about all that stuff. I should probably now address the elephant-shaped ink blot in the room. The main reason that some people are mad at this show. The show is too woke, and they made Rorschach racist. Now, you guys know I don't really talk about politics on this channel because it just ain't fun and it ruins the mood. But this is Watchmen, so it's going to come up here and there. Now, I'm not really going to entertain that first statement too much because Watchmen is already woke. I think I've already illustrated that plenty in this video. I also literally just reread it 2 days ago. And I honestly don't know how anybody could read this comic and know of Alan Moore and not understand the political leanings of this comic book. In the original Watchmen story, we have only 2 characters that are even close to a conservative mindset. One of those characters is the comedian. He kills and assaults women, and he loves to shoot people. He revels in violence and hedonism. He's an awful person, and he is this comic's version of a Republican patriot. Yeah, he kinda has a soft side when it comes to his daughter and the guilt he feels when he learns of Ozymandias' plot, but he never really does anything to rectify all of the bad shit he's done, so he just dies a bad person. And this is fine with me. I think he's a really interesting character. But you have to accept that this is some of the only conservative representation in the story. The other character who represents this side of the political spectrum is Rorschach. Rorschach hates liberals, women, and basically anybody who doesn't think the way he thinks. He kinda just hates everybody.
All those liberals and intellectuals and smooth talkers.
He hurts random people, he smells bad, he has no friends, and he eats cold beans. But goddamn, he has a respect for true patriots. Alan Moore himself has said that Rorschach is a bad person, and if you like and agree with him, then you are also a bad person. Now, I think that's a bit extreme, but this is the guy that made the character, so you kinda have to put his point of view into perspective here. So now, in this show, we have a faction of terrorists who all kind of agree with Rorschach. And on its own, I don't think this would be a problem. But the problem people have with this is that the terrorists are also racist. So now people think, oh, so if I agree with Rorschach, then this show's calling me a racist. Which isn't really the case at all. See, at the end of Watchmen, Rorschach sent his journal to a far-right magazine just in case he didn't make it back from his little adventure. This journal is the only proof that Ozymandias blew up New York with the giant squid. But it also contains Rorschach's feelings on society. Completely out of context, might I add. Let's also point out that they show us that this magazine that he sends his journal to is racist as fuck. This is Rorschach's favorite thing to read, by the way. And now we have countless angry nerds on the internet saying, how dare you say Rorschach is racist? But okay, let's give everybody the benefit of the doubt. He never does or says anything racist in the comic. Not outright. I mean, he gets kind of close, but I'm gonna be fair and say that he doesn't. When you read his thoughts in the context of the original story, you understand that he's a troubled individual with a lot of pain. The fact is, if you take his words out of context, it does sound like the ravings of a radical lunatic. And it's not unreasonable that radical lunatics take his musings completely out of context and use them to further their agenda. It happens in the real world, and it has since the dawn of the written word. The first speech we hear from these terrorists is almost word for word the first speech from Rorschach in the comic.
There are so many deserving of retribution, and there is so little time.
And I find that fascinating, because in a regular superhero story, the legacy of a dead superhero would inspire people to be good. But this is Watchmen, and things aren't that simple in Watchmen. In this series, the legacy of a dead superhero actually inspires people to do bad things. And honestly, I think that's way more interesting. And oh, boo-hoo, it means Rorschach died for nothing. Yeah, you know what? Yes, it does. Rorschach died because he wouldn't compromise, and that was the point. In a normal superhero story, this man would have liberated the world because he stood up for what he believed in. But things don't work that way here. He judges things on the basis of good and evil, and his criteria for what is good and evil is kind of flawed. Oh, and look at these guys, they're wearing the same mask, and they also see things in black and white, in some ways more literally than others. So I'm sorry if I don't agree with the idea that this show is inaccurate and that it ruins the characters. If you really wanted Rorschach to start a cultural revolution that liberates the world, I think that kind of ruins the entire point of the original story. That would basically just be the writers telling you, oh yeah, because Rorschach was right all along. And it would ruin the point of the comic. Rorschach can't be right, neither can Ozymandias. You are supposed to leave the story not knowing who you would side with because it's supposed to be morally gray. That is the entire point of the goddamn story. When people get mad about this show, I think it's really just from a lack of understanding the source material, and I hate saying that because it sounds condescending, and I don't like being condescending. But with this series, there are a lot of ways to approach it. I first read the comic 10 years ago when I was a fucking teenager. I didn't even think I understood half of the real-world elements in the story. And this week I reread it, and I saw a lot of things I didn't see before. The comic is very heavily dependent on what you bring into it. And I think the show is no different. I do think that this show is a very nuanced way to build on an existing world. And I normally don't talk about shows when they aren't finished yet, but I think it's worth checking out if what I've said so far is interesting to you. If you're a fan of the series and you go in with an open mind, I think you might agree with me.